January 18, 1945. The cold arrived like a promise. Hard, clean, and very loud. Friedrich Keller had been awake long before the roll call because the cold held a kind of authority that did not allow for sleep. He stood with the others on the hard-packed parade ground of the camp outside Concord, New Hampshire, breath clouding in small white ghosts, wool collar turned up against the wind. They counted like a machine. 1, 2, names and numbers that slid past as if on a conveyor belt. Behind the wire, beyond the watchtowers, the world was all white and quiet. Then, with a sound that did not belong in any of the memories he owned, something scraped. It was not artillery. It was not a truck. It was a blade, metal biting through snow, the scrape of iron on compacted frost, a long, deliberate cut. For a moment, no one moved. The sound was simple, ordinary, unintentionally sacred to men used to measuring danger by volume and velocity. Friedrich kept his hands in his pockets because there was nothing else to do. He watched the fence line, watched the road beyond, watched the shape that rolled slow and confident past the guardhouse, a plow, hunched like a beast with a single fixed jaw, pushing white aside. He had seen machines in war, tanks that advanced like a moving horizon, aircraft that sucked the sky of life, engines that hummed with the promise of destruction. Machines had been instruments of order and of disorder, and men had learned quickly to respond to their sounds. This one made a sound that made no immediate catalog in his mind. It was neither weapon nor threat. Still, the first thing that moved through about 399 bodies at roll call was silence, a sudden tightening that was not just physical, the tightening of a memory network keyed to survive. Friedrich listened to the blade. He felt in his ribs something like a question. Outside the fence wire, the blade scraped cleanly and kept going. The plow cleaned a path, not a line of fire or a path of retreat. For the men who had been fitted to uncomfort, the difference was not obvious at first. Hans Müller, younger and sharper-jawed than most, let his eyes narrow. He had been in battles where a machine's approach meant loss. He had watched men fall in squares and lines, and known how the body learns to flinch. His fingers twitched at his side. The memory of guns fired from the obscurity of a machine was a seam he could feel under his skin. Otto, who had been a mechanic before the war, and who kept a grease rag in the back pocket of his trousers because he could not imagine not tinkering, moved differently. He scanned the familiar vocabulary of metal, curved blade, hydraulic rams, chains on the wheels, and did something that no one else did right then. He smiled, a small, private smile that had nothing like relief in it and everything like recognition. Machines could be read like books. Otto liked reading.
He squinted at the plow as it threw a clean arc of snow away from the lane and felt the edges of his own knowledge snap into place. The sound was no longer a threat, it was language to him. Sergeant William Harper, who supervised the compound with a tired, sun-baked patience, watched the prisoners more than the machine. He had seen fear, curiosity, the look of men who would try to measure a stranger's intention. The sergeant did not step forward. There was no reason to. He had a civilian's eye for rhythm, a quiet understanding that new things arrive, and that sometimes the best response is to wait until the first pause. Charlie, the driver, nodded to his own motion and steered the plow down the road as if he had always been doing just this. At first, they only watched. The men discussed it in fragments of speech and gestures when roll call released them. They stood in clusters near the huts, lips blue at the edges, woolen caps pulled low. Someone mimed the blade cutting. Someone else gestured to the fence as if to ask whether the plow might take the wire with it. Hans repeated, in a tone that did not include the possibility of comfort, an old wartime joke that had lost its humor. Otto waved his hands to explain a part he could see, proving that understanding can be a kind of salve. Friedrich did not speak much. He moved with the thought that the world had, in a small place, shifted its grammar. If this moment were a storybook, it would insist on contrast. The blade's indifferent practical work and the prisoner's immediate instinctive interpretations. But life rarely renders itself as neat binaries. The plow, simple as it was, proved more complicated in practice. Its presence outside the camp was at first a small domestic disruption, the sound of a blade changing the punctuation of morning, the visual of a machine swiping clean the road. For some prisoners, it was a reminder of power, someone with resources, someone whose routine did not include counting names. For others, it promised nothing more than cleared access to deliveries and the possibility of warmth. After the first day, repetition took hold. The plow returned again and again, a pattern settling over mornings like frost on the gutters. Its passes became a primitive clock. The low mechanical rumble in the distance signaled the beginning of movement for the men inside the camp. Life here had always been marked by routine: roll call, kitchen line, work details. But the plow introduced a new, external metronome. Its arrival was not an incident of power so much as a maintenance ritual. It cleared the way for trucks, for fuel, for the thin chain of contact between this fenced world and the town beyond. And in the small interior of the compound, routine does the heavy work of calming. "It's only a plow," Otto told a handful of men as they examined the faint tracks it left on the road. He spoke low, as if translating not just language but mood.
He lifted a gloved hand and mimed the angle of the blade. "Cuts snow," he said in broken English, and the translation landed like a rock into the shallow pool of their suspicion. Hans only snorted and shook his head, but even he listened. Practical admiration seeped into the group's talk as naturally as thaw. The second pass answered the first. On the third week, the plow, running its appointed route, slowed near the camp gate. That small act, merely a pause, worked on men like a soft-shaped hammer. Charlie had stopped to look. He had no military bearing, no grand gestures. He was, in a way that made it harder to keep suspicion alive, simply performing the business of his day. He stepped down from his cab and stood with his hands shoved in his coat pockets, breath folding like smoke. Sergeant Harper spoke with him for a moment, distance polite and careful. The gate remained closed, but the plow's driver was now a figure with a name and a rhythm rather than an anonymous motion. When Charlie walked the stretch beside the fence, he offered no speeches. He offered a small, almost negligible kindness. He raised his mittened hand in a gesture that, to the prisoners gathered, read as ordinary civility. For Friedrich, the hand looked scarred and calloused, the same sort of hands that once tightened the bolts on harvester machines in their village. It was a tiny exchange, the sort of thing that might be forgotten in a different narrative, but to men whose lives had been narrowed to essential acts, it was a fissure through which the world showed a different light. Gesture matters here. It matters more than words. Charlie, when a delivery truck got stuck on a bank of ice at the gate weeks later, did not call for a crew. He climbed down, waded into the cold, and began to shove. Harper barked directions, and then, in a way that surprised some of the prisoners, pulled the gate open wide enough for the rescuers. Otto, less interested in symbolic acts and more in the mechanics of how things move, stood near the truck with his hands in grease-darkened gloves and offered to hook a chain. The work began as a transaction. Tire meets chain, man pushes. But work is social. Shoulders brushed. Grunts became coordinated effort. Men spoke in clipped phrases. In broken English and German, small instructions turned into small jokes. The truck lurched free and rolled onto clearer pavement. Water dripped from its undercarriage like applause. What those episodes produced was not a conversion narrative, but the softer process of acclimation. They learned that some machines, some people, did not announce hostility with noise or posture. The plow kept coming, and in coming it taught a few lessons. The world sometimes cleared its paths without needing permission, and small acts of utility could coexist alongside larger violences in a life. The men were not naive. Hans's distrust never fully evaporated.
But even he took from that day a grudging acknowledgement that hands could be used for more than holding rifles. At night, when the hut seemed closer assembled via the insulated skin of the camp, Friedrich lay awake and thought back to the string of mornings. The plow, in his memory, had a voice made less of machine noise than of rhythm. Scrape, hum, retreat. A repeated phrase that stitched days together. It was a sound that asked for nothing, but made a promise that the road would still exist when the men woke. He found himself timing his breaths to where the sound should be. The predictability of its return made it a kind of small blessing. Routine has a curative quality because it returns the mind to repetition rather than surprise. In the severe weather the men had lived through in previous winters, surprise could be lethal. The plow offered a different kind of repetition. It arrived in the mornings, it scraped, it left. Later, on mornings when a cold delivery arrived for the infirmary or the doctor expected a fresh set of bandages, the cleared road made things function. The camp's life, the distribution of the day, and the redistribution of tasks depended on those simple logistics. It is peculiar how much of peace is built on mundane accuracy. A blade angled correctly, a chain hooked to a towing ring, a man willing to steady his hands in the cold. People noticed what they needed to notice. The camp doctor, a figure of quiet administration whose hands smelled of iodine and soap, watched the plow with a practical eye. He did not anthropomorphize machines, but he appreciated how cleared roads shortened delivery times.
Guards saw the plow as an element of the civic order they had been hired to guard. Charlie remained mostly an outline in their daily scripts, a driver performing his duty, invisible in many ways precisely because his job implied ordinariness. Change arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a collection of small gestures. In mid-February, when snow came wet and heavy and the plow slid more slowly, Charlie left a small parcel at the camp office wrapped in brown paper. No one announced the parcel. Sergeant Harper found it sitting on the desk with no note more than an old glove placed on top, the sort of glove men used to scrape ice from windows. He known the hand to whom he could trace such a thing. Harper passed the parcel to the camp clerk, and the clerk placed it where the men who worked in the stores might never sit. Rumors are born of such small actions. Charlie had meant to give it to the man, perhaps. Charlie had been sorry about something, perhaps. Or perhaps it was a bad joke. Hans made a remark that was not funny. Otto went to the parcel first, hands curious in a way that had little to do with possession and everything to do with process. He untied the string, opened the top with careful fingers, and revealed, inside, gloves, work gloves, thick and sturdy, with a faint smell of oil and an unfamiliar brand stamped on the inside.
They were not many. There were only a few. Otto looked up at Harper and then down at the gloves, as if the choice of whether to accept them required consent from someone else. Harper shrugged, as though the choice was Otto's alone. The distribution of those gloves produced a scene that, to an observer, could be distilled into a single line: generosity, offered and accepted. But the truth was messier. The gloves symbolized a thin thread with which two worlds could be sewn momentarily together: civilians who kept roads open and prisoners whose hands had once been trained to other tasks. Otto offered gloves to men who had problems with cold hands. He did it by touching each shoulder and murmuring a name. He did not speak at length. That day, when Otto placed the palm of a glove into Friedrich's hand, Friedrich felt something like a clean domestic dignity, an admission that some work could be reconstructed without the older violence that had accompanied it. Not every man chose to accept that kind of easing. Hans took one glove and let it hang from his fingers like an object under review. He kept his skepticism like a thing to be worn in public. But even Hans warmed the glove tentatively when he latched onto a shovel to help clear the gate later. He discovered the glove transferred more than heat. Fingers that had been small and brittle under a cold wind suddenly fit into leather. The fit of a glove can reorder a hand's memory. It may feel like a treason to some memory, and unwelcome comfort to others. In the weeks that followed, gloved hands moved differently. They reached, gripped, adjusted, and in a quiet fashion began to build trust by repetition. There was no ceremony, no big speech, no exchange of national anthems. The crossing happened in the course of labor. Working on a stuck truck, lifting a rail, adjusting chains, these acts required coordination. The guards' thumbs blackened, the prisoners' wool sleeves dampened. A cigarette was offered without much talk. A man called Charlie said, "Cold job," and another answered with a small smile. In the way of ordinary work, competence began to trump the old categories. Otto's assessments of the plow's mechanics made small practical bridges. He spoke of the blade's angle, the chain's grip, the need for a good anchor point on the axle. Men who had been enemies for years at a stretch found common language in torque and leverage. The plow's sound, which had once signaled an unknown, began to assume the contour of time itself. Morning by morning it arrived, scraped, and moved on. It became the camp's metronome. The men scheduled their breakfasts around it. The kitchen staff felt relief when the road was clear because it meant a truck might arrive with promised supplies. They began to tell time by it and found in that rhythm a small homecoming. Machines are often unromantic, but repetition can become liturgy in a place starved of ritual. The winter drew towards spring, and the snow became less absolute.
The plow's pass grew fewer. Its voice receded into the background. In March, the rumble of marching fronts entered the men's radio reports. Small items at first, then larger. They listened as news moved through the camp the way frost moves, thin, then broader. Germany's surrender approached like weather shifts a man can sense but only name later. There was no jubilation, no collective shout. Men who had survived by measured coolness took news into their bones with a muted acceptance. The plow did not stop its work as if to celebrate. It kept the road clear because the road needed keeping. The moral theater did not need an audience to be true. If the emotional crescendo of the plow story is not a shout, it is a tightening that loosens. The accumulation of small acts, Charlie's pause at the gate, his shove to free a truck, the gloves left in a parcel, did not erase the war. But these acts shifted the men's internal climate. Friedrich found when the war ended and the uniform was traded or taken that the memory of a blade scraping through snow had become lodged with other more luminous memories. The warm mug passed at dawn by a cook when the coal delivery finally came, the hand of a guard that steadied a ladder,
the conversation about machines that allowed men to talk about something other than what they had lost. The post-war years, when they came, fractured lives into new patterns. Friedrich returned, in the years that followed, to work that involved the earth in simple ways. He kept his hands busy and his mouth quiet, learning anew the patient choreography of small tasks. He married, raised children, and took work at a dairy that required early mornings and steady hands, work that honored repetition the way the plow had. Otto opened a small repair shop, a cramped place in a town where people learned that engines to be examined without the expectation of violence. He kept a small picture on the windowsill of a hand with a glove, folded like a memory. Hans found a vocation that allowed him to teach younger men the skills that had once been demanded by harsher ends. He spoke with a hard-edged patience sometimes, but those who listened learned technique rather than rancor. All three of them carried the plow with them, not as a talisman but as a piece of weather in their inner weather. Friedrich learned to value the steady, unceremonious labor that kept people moving. Otto's admiration for mechanical reason remained, but it was tempered by a new understanding of the social life of tools. Hans's distrust became more selective. If he kept his guard up, he also steered young men into channels where muscle could be skill instead of armor. There is a small, ordinary final image that binds and explains. Years later, when Friedrich was old enough that his hands looked like maps of soft scars, he stood with his grandson on a cold morning by the side of a highway.
The grandson, small and impatient, asked questions about everything, about frost on the grass, about the fitness of the plow. Friedrich watched a modern machine cut through a fresh storm with the ease of a man who had been taught to appreciate continuity. The new plow was wider, more efficient by numbers, but to Friedrich it needed no qualification. He remembered the hand that had left the parcel of gloves, the shove that had freed a truck, the repeated scraping that had produced rhythm. He put a glove on his grandson's small hand and said quietly, "The road stays open because someone decides it should." It was a simple sentence, not a sermon. The boy repeated it the way boys repeat any sentence to test whether it is sticky. Friedrich let it be. He did not insist on a moral beyond what the world already offered, that maintenance matters, and that small, regular acts can anchor larger, noisier events. In the end, the plow was not a challenge to virtue or a promise of redemption. It was an instrument, and it became a story about how people receive what is given to them. Memory, in this way, is a slow accumulation. For Friedrich, the plow's scrape acquired a tone, one that would, at times, become an indicator of stability. Once a sound of suspicion, it softened to a sound they trusted, in the measured way people can come to trust a refrain of a hymn. The men in the camp did not become friends with the plow or with the driver. They kept their histories, they carried the grief and the habits of survival. But the presence of ordinary machines and of ordinary people performing ordinary work altered the texture of their days enough that when they stepped back from the fence and into a larger world, they had received a small but persistent reminder that utility could be humane, and that labor in its small and steady forms could reconnect a world splintered by grander violences. If there is a lesson contained in this quiet story, it is not tidy. It refuses the grandeur of a catharsis or the neat deliverance of a moral tidied for a lecture. The true movement is granular, hands slipping into gloves, a blade tilted just so, a truck freed from a snowbank by people who would not have touched each other a year before. Those acts add up, not into salvation, but into a kind of reshaping, into jobs taken after returning, into a repair shop opened in a small town, into a class where a teacher shows a student how to hold a wrench. The plow's presence had been a practical matter, the men made of it a human thing. One afternoon, decades after the camp had closed its gates for the last time, Friedrich walked with a neighbor to the town center. A modern plow, its blade bright under the sun, moved slowly along the main road. Children watched it, enthralled by the motion of metal so purposeful as to seem almost ceremonial. Friedrich paused and felt in his chest that old small tightening, the awareness of a sound that once meant other things. He wanted to explain, but he did not need to. His grandson tugged his sleeve and asked questions that were new in their simplicity. "The road stays open," Friedrich repeated, and then added, as if to clarify what he had always believed, "because someone decides it should." He did not offer neat resolutions beyond that line. The plow passed, and the road remained clear. The small acts of one winter, Charlie's hand at the gate, Otto's explanation of chain placement, the glove in a parcel, lived on in those who had been present. They did not forgive whole histories or wipe clean the memory of loss, but they did teach a capacity to accept that, in the wake of violence, the everyday could resume under different rules, rules that required patience, labor, and a willingness to let practical kindness be what it was.
If you enjoyed this close look at how unremarkable actions can shape lives, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this waiting. In the quiet that followed, the plow continued its work. It scraped. It hummed. It moved on. The men who had watched it learned to measure mornings by its presence. The road, over time, stayed open.